Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Sabotage and Timon Klein. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the American Reformer Podcast. Usual host here, Timon Klein, editor-in-chief of American Reformer. And I'm joined today not by one guest, but two guests. I think we've done this one other time. And the only other time I did it, Chase Davis was also on the podcast. And I think it went fine, Chase. I think it went fine. And that time we had William Wolf, an only slightly more subdued guest this time joining Chase, which is Joe Rigney. So we will begin the show, I think, Joe, by talking about a article you recently wrote for us at American Reformer. And it begins by introducing or riffing off of some stuff, Chase, that you had written and put out at your Substack, I think, but came from a speech at a conference. And we'll probably entitle this episode "The Right-Wing John Mark Comer." That's how Chase puts it. So, Chase, why don't you begin by introducing this subject and what we're talking about? Some people might not know who JMC is, nor why we need a right-wing one if they do know what he is. So explain yourself to the audience for this ridiculous analogy and illustration you've put into our brains.
Happy to do so, yeah. And you feel free to cut me off because I could go off on this. This was the subject of my research with my book that came out a few years ago now, Trinitarian Formation. Spiritual formation has always been a topic of interest to me. I grew up kind of borderline Big Eva megachurch Christianity, went to Texas A&M, as your other esteemed guest did as well, kind of saturated with a version of Christian spirituality that was very common and assumed to be normal. And up until 2020, there were a lot of conversations on what did spiritual maturity look like, what does holiness look like. They would try to bring back resources like Baxter, the Reformed pastor, or other things to emphasize Christian maturity. But the question really came to my mind when we decided to plant a church here in Boulder in 2011, and we're reading the Bible, studying the Bible, preaching the Bible, and we're going, what does it mean when Jesus says make disciples? And that to me was like, and it still bugs me, because that question, what does it mean when Jesus said that, introduces a lot of concepts into especially evangelicalism in America in terms of how people define it. Because you could have 1,000 definitions and people will take what Jesus is saying and kind of insert their own approach to spirituality today. And so John Mark Comer is a great example of that. He literally asked the same question in his book, and he defines it as we should be an apprentice of Jesus. That's what discipleship means. So he goes back to kind of rabbinic tradition and tries to, bring it up from there and apply it to today and make applications for Christians. The reason that listeners to American Reformer or others would be interested in this is because John Mark Comer is wildly popular. He's incredibly influential, sold at least 100,000 books, maybe 200,000. He came on the scene with a podcast, This Cultural Moment. And I can't remember when that was published. I think it was prior to 2020. But I had younger congregants, younger friends sending it to me saying, this guy is great. I think it was mainly because he had an Australian co-host, and Americans just have this weird tick where if somebody speaks in that kind of accent, they immediately give them tons of credibility. But, he had some things to say about what was going on culturally in America. He writes several books, this one, Practicing the Way. And it's just riddled with the same stuff we've seen, whether it's from the emerging church debate in the 2000s, or many other kind of approaches to Christian spirituality. So this stuff is like right in my lane academically. And so I can get into more. Why don't I talk about why right-wing John Mark Comer? The reason I frame it that way, part of it was experiential. So when I was jettisoned out of Acts 29, I found myself in a lot of relationship circles of influence and reading people like Doug Wilson and others. And really, they had a very different approach to Christian maturity. And it was like very curious to me because you'd get around these other men, strong, assertive, ambitious, godly men, and they were not talking the same language that all these other Christians in America are talking. And this kind of, it didn't bother me in a negative sense. It was just more of like, what is this? Why no one here is asking, hey, brother, I just want to ask you how your heart is. Like what's going on? There's like a disconnect. So the reason I talk about a right-wing John Mark Comer is I want to translate the great things that are happening on the Christian right, particularly, into kind of average evangelical speak, so that they can understand more of what they need to pursue in life, how they need to pursue glory, pursue greatness, how that all needs to be submitted to God. And if we don't do that, there's kind of two things. One, they're going to keep reading books like John Mark Comer and thinking this is kind of the zenith of spirituality, this pacifistic, lethargic approach, where we're with Jesus, becoming like Jesus. And that will just kind of be the thing that evangelicalism continues to be known for. The other thing is that if we don't reclaim a lot of these things, these spiritual disciplines, Sabbath, prayer, Bible reading, going to church, and we don't appropriately articulate them in a way that's biblically cogent and historically accurate, the new right that is coming up will hear us talk about those things and think we're trying to suppress their God-given instincts. We're trying to make them into women. We're trying to, curtail natural kind of God-given ambition and that kind of thing. And so my hope in writing this and speaking about this stuff is to articulate in a way that helps normal evangelicals connect with the Lord in a way that is biblically consistent and not riddled with kind of leftism, which is what John Mark Comer and many others, Dallas Willard, many others in this discipline who are very popular, have just subtly, what Joe writes in his article, kneecapped a lot of men from striving from greatness and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I just wanted to, as a point of fact and record, just wanted to say that Joe Rigney surely sold over 200,000 books. So John Mark Comer's not that big of a deal.
True.
In any case, we'll get it will happen. Long enough timeline, it'll happen. No, I think that's a great summary, Chase, of where you're coming from on this, and I'm sure the audience kind of intuits the need for what you're talking about. I mean, I think especially Joe, as you begin talking in your article, at the beginning of your article, it's also this sort of therapeutic aspect that's in John Mark Comer and others like him in this similar vein or sort of segment of evangelicalism. And I think that we can recognize one as a problem, but is inherently effeminate also. I mean, Chase, you were just touching on this. So necessarily sort of in the posture and approach, even if they're not explicitly kneecapping people, even in some of the ways Joe talks about later, it's already set up for sort of masculine failure because of the approach and posture. But Joe, I mean, you began in kind of pulling from. Well, Chase, I wanted to throw this out first. I mean, I thought it was a great. I think I'm going to get the three right that you throw out as sort of a contrast to John Mark Comer, the John Mark Comer three. You give three of sort of duty, agency, and strength. Should be the guiding, sort of guiding our ambition and where we want our spirituality to go, especially as men. Expound on that a little bit before we turn to what Joe adds to your discussion.
Yeah, so the opposite is what you typically experience in this kind of, I'll just throw out some names like Francis Chan, David Platt, these kind of big names. Their approach to spirituality is very therapeutic and sentimental, experiential. And I think what's frustrating is, as someone who also respects the Puritans, we do have an experiential faith. We want to preach what Doug Wilson calls a hot gospel. We want people to know the living God personally. But a lot of that language has been consumed by a therapeutic approach to that experience. And this kind of gets into phenomenology of religion, but we don't need to go there. The opposite of that is duty. So you will experience more of the Lord as you fulfill your duties and just obey. And so this is very difficult for many normal Christians to understand because they've been so therapeuticized, so soaked in therapeutic culture that they will have a basic instinct like, if I don't feel like going to church and I were to go, that would be inauthentic. Therefore, I shouldn't go because God wouldn't be pleased with that. God wants authentic worship, right? And so that's the kind of stuff I try to bring up in my preaching and teaching often, is that you fulfilling your duties actually forms you and develops in you affections. The same way we love our wife, we should love her regardless of how we feel on that particular day. We should fulfill our duties. The other one, passivity, it's typically very passive in terms of not just receiving from the Lord, but also agency in the world. And so that's why I talk about agency. We need to have a biblical view of agency, and we need to encourage men to exercise agency and see where they can exercise agency over their responsibilities and domains. That doesn't have to look grandiose. I use a lot of illustrations talking about founding the West and crossing oceans and that kind of thing. For a lot of guys, they're not going to cross an ocean. They're going to go to work. They're going to work in a cubicle. But what does it look like even in that domain to exercise agency and drive and have ambition? And so, yeah, those are a few of the critiques I make in my article.
Yeah, and I just would want to add, sort of in defense of the Puritans also, it's a safe space to do this. I would say, if anything, you can say they had good balance with these things. But I think actually even the experiential side, people that is sort of popularized today, was probably less ink was probably spilled on that than matters of duty, even providential duty, eschatological duty. Their sort of postmillennialism is over exaggerated in terms of where they saw even the place of New England fitting in this. They wanted to make sure that they were fit tools, right? If Providence did choose to use them, they were ready to go. And the amount of talk about sort of station in life, your duty within that station, family, and especially for men externally. This is what even Max Weber sort of recognizes this. It's the agency and energy of Protestantism that creates capitalism. If you follow his thesis, not the other way around, right? So this kind of agency to shape the world, in a sense, is there's definitely something Protestant about it. And these things were talked about a lot, as was just what we would recognize as sort of general masculine traits, is talked about a lot. And some of their heroes or people they would elevate that were Puritans but not divines, were men of action. And you see a lot of even theologians talking to these men in particular, merchants, explorers, all this kind of, especially rulers. All I'm saying is there's a balance even in that, with the Puritans, who we think of as sort of the standard bearers of like experiential faith. And as Joe will, I'm sure, talk about, the experience isn't bad, right? It's not bad to have emotions or experience in these things, but to have them balanced. So the Puritans have already modeled this for us as well. Just read them widely.
But I will say, Time,
yes, go ahead.
I mean, it's just so curious to me, like a book like Gentle and Lowly, that I don't know how many it sold, but it seemed to have, fanfare. It had the marketing. Yeah, right. It had a lot of push behind it. It was very selective. And a lot of the things we get from the Puritans today are selective in that way. They neglect the corpus of literature that we have, where they wrote on many other activities, and they simply take from the Puritans that which fits into the modern disenchantment that we have, which is a therapeutic, experiential, and they even misinterpret that, right? So when Orland is quoting Sibbes, I think it is, he ignores so many of the other writings, and he's doing is trying to use that to bolster up an experience of the Lord, which is very, frankly, feminized and pacifistic. So,
no, that's right. I mean, a good moniker for the Puritans would be something like, I don't know, like all of Christ for all of life. Like that would describe the Puritans well, I think. But,
to quote the Secretary of Defense.
To quote the Secretary of Defense. They wouldn't approve of his tattoos, but probably everything else. Yes, very, very good. I think it's a good segue into, Joe, what you're trying to add to the discussion, sort of yes and amen to what Chase has set up here. At great length, I might say. If people try to go read this from Chase, it's extremely long. You won't get through it. But we've given you the cliff notes here. But Joe, I think you've added important things to this, or sort of applications and further explication of what Chase is getting at. And you talk about sort of at the beginning of what you're contributing to this, how conservative evangelicals, despite the fact that like they might be reliably conservative insofar as, if Comer, like Rob Bell, decides to deny hell, which you predict is probably his next stop, that may come. We'll timestamp this now. They would denounce that, right? They'd be like, no, hell's a stable biblical doctrine affirmed by our tradition, all this. But at the same time, even as they perform that maneuver, which is a good thing, they still actually are much like John Mark Comer in the way that they approach these same topics we're covering. So explain that to us a little bit of how actually they are playing in sort of his sandbox.
Yeah. So when I read Chase's thing, I thought, man, this is right. I can recognize it. I recognize, the similarity between Comer and Brian McLaren and Rob Bell and the emergent stuff. That was all kind of coming around whenever I was in college, also at Texas A&M with Chase. And so recognized it, and also recognized that, like, I went a different direction. I got heavily into John Piper in college, and there wasn't, one of the distinctives I think of Piper was that it wasn't this kind of soft effeminacy. I mean, that he emphasized the passions, he emphasized this experiential dimension. But I think one of the reasons that Piper resonated so strongly, particularly with that kind of millennial generation that came of age from like the mid 90s up to like 2012, 13, like that generation, my generation, was because it was a very strong masculine note. Like it was make war on sin, like live for the glory of God. There was ambition, find your passion, live for the supremacy of God in all things, all of these things. And so I recognized the thing that Chase was describing, and then recognized that I think a lot of evangelicals, conservative reformed evangelicals, the TGC type evangelicals, some of them at least would go, yeah, but we're not doing that. We're not going to go down the therapeutic, deny penal substitution, pare down the rough edges. Like, we're going to hold the line on the doctrine. But then as I was reading it, I was also like, but there is this kind of common ground. And so what I wanted to add to what Chase had said, which was, so I wanted to say yes and amen, duty, agency, strength, let's recover these. But then there's this kind of principle that I don't know. I think I picked it up. I talk about it in the article in debates over worship music, when people would criticize the modern worship music because of the Jesus is my boyfriend dynamic. And they would say, it's all about this like longing, aching for God and longing, aching for Christ. And it sounds pretty gay. And I was like, well, the problem though, is that like the Bible does talk that way. Like the Bible has that language. Like if you're going to blast the, I long for you, God stuff, it's like, well, then you have a problem with Psalms. And so I had to kind of think more deeply about that. And what I came to realize is the problem is not the presence of the longing and aching for God or things like that. The problem is the absence of something else that kind of situates that longing. And in particular in the worship music space, it's kind of the absence of the muscular, the martial, the imprecatory. And so it's this selective, you guys are talking about the Puritans and the kind of selective appropriation of them. So we'll read them on, the devotional aspects and kind of circumscribed, like very, pick and choose, but nobody's reading them on political philosophy, because if they did, you'd be accused of being a Christian nationalist. And so it's this selective appropriation of Puritanism. Similarly, there's a selective in our worship music space, this like selective use of the Psalms. Like we'll take that one verse from the Psalms. And I remember years ago, this one didn't make it into the article, but it was an interesting example that got me thinking. So back in the day, Bethlehem Baptist Church, Desiring God, had this fighter verse program where it was like, memorizing the Bible, kind of verses at a time, but often like large chunks. So it would like work through, chapters. And you would have this whole program of how to memorize the Bible that they would promote, things like that. And at one point, I think back in like the 2000s, they were memorizing Psalm 139. And you're going through and you've got the, God hems me in behind and before. This is too lofty for me. I can't contain it. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. All of these kind of classic biblical texts about God's intimate knowledge of us as creatures. And then you get like down to verse 19 or 20, and all of a sudden it's, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? I hate them with a perfect hatred. And you get the gnarly bit. And it was even too spicy for the fighter verse people. They skipped those verses and jumped straight from, you've searched me and know me, to Lord, search me and know my heart, test me and know my anxious thoughts. So they skipped 2 verses, and Piper actually wrote an article about it. Like, why did we do that? And you can go find it. It's called The Verses We Skipped. And he basically says, like, we think this would require too much explanation for people. Like, they wouldn't get, like, how do I memorize and pray this to God to hate his enemies? Don't we supposed to love people? And so they just thought, you know what, that's too much. So they skipped it. They didn't include it. And then but he did offer the explanation because it did require some. But that's a good example of this kind of like, there's certain things we don't know what to do with. So that was the kind of principle as I was reading Chase was the problem sometimes is not what's said, it's what's left unsaid. Or the problem is not what you're commending or saying, but it's what you're not allowed to say. And so with Comer, and even with evangelical approaches, you're going to get, hey, you need to be reading your Bible. You need to be praying. You need to be having an experiential religion. And I want to go, yes, 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 and amen. But the imbalance or the problem comes with what are you never allowed to do? What are the things that you're kind of going to get kneecapped when you do it? So that's kind of where my mind was as I was reading Chase is there is this commonality even among those who would have a more martial, masculine, ambitious view of spiritual formation and maturity that would be directed to killing sin and mortification. They'd have that, but I still think that there was something missing.
Yeah, I could. As you're talking and just about Piper, I mean, I remember. This is going back to something Chase said but I remember an article from John Piper at Desiring God years ago where he addressed like the feelings question, like when you go to church, should you go basically if you're just not, feeling it? And he basically did like the Pascal thing. Like if you can't feel it, perform your duty, see how that makes you feel when you get there. Right. Go and be in the presence of God amongst his people and see how that makes you feel. And you still might not feel anything, but you're supposed to do it. It was a very helpful article. I always remember that one. But the point you're making about how we treat the Psalms. I mean, my elders this summer are preaching through the Psalms, and it was just interesting to me that when we came to Psalm 109, which was a great sermon on it, it didn't avoid. Well, you can't really in 109 avoid much of the imprecatory stuff. But it was funny that, I think appropriately so for our congregation, for the audience, you did have to like prepare them for it. Right. And my thought was not that it was wrong to prepare us for it, but that we need preparation for it. That's what's striking. And that like the first 10 minutes of the sermon is like getting you ready to handle what's in there because it's so foreign. Right. Yeah. Like probably even privately in our devotional lives, people don't know what to do with it and just skip it, right? But certainly publicly and corporately, then it's like really strange. Like, what are we saying here? If this is being preached from the pulpit to us and on our behalf to the world, like, what are we telling it? Then you get into this strange feeling of what's your witness and all this, but it's there, right? So it's just, I think this is totally a problem you put your finger on, and that's what I was thinking through it. And last thing I'll say again, I want to ask you about sort of the point about masculine corporate agency, riffing off of one of Chase's three things he brought up, and to pull in and also this, and especially the corporate part, back to the Puritans. I mean, Edwards, it's probably in the miscellanies, that's what I've read the most of, but Edwards has this like, it's not just masculine and martial, it's a corporate and providential identity with Britain, where when he'll write about getting like news reports of victories in battle, of enemy navies being sunk. So it's not even just a nation. This is an empire in the 1740s. And he's like, this is God's blessing and providence for us because we're his people. So that's it's your enemies dying at sea and Britain getting the victory. And to him, this is like just totally normal to speak about it in scriptural and terms drawn from the Psalms, right? Like that, but this is a corporate sort of application of this that would make most people today, especially in the therapeutic vein, very uncomfortable, and Edwards probably be accused of a bad hermeneutic and application and bad exegesis or something on that, right? But it's just totally natural to him. That as a rough segue, Joe, into another thing you pull out, which this is especially all this sort of bent and approach, which you illustrate through the worship wars, is especially a problem for masculine, male friendships and social or external action, doing kind of what, guys do, competitive things, confrontational things, so on and so forth. So get us set up with that, and we can discuss that as well.
Yeah. So if the issue is the problem's not what's present, what's said, but what's left unsaid, or what's not included in the paradigm, as I was thinking about Chase's article and going like, why is it that there is kind of this, I could feel a commonality between even the kind of therapeutic, Comer-like spiritual formation, and that while superficially or at some level, there's a real difference between a more masculine wage war on sin, kill your sin, pursue holiness, do your duty, even when you don't feel it. What was a common thread? And it was the absence of corporate Christian agency, of this idea of like, we do things together. And there's this corporate mission. And then as I started to run that down, I said, well, that's not quite true, because I think there's a lot of evangelicals saying, no, we do things together. We worship God corporately, or we do missions together. We go to the nations together. And so it was like, no, so there is this kind of even corporate dimension. But then it was like, oh, it's corporate mission as applied to social, political, and cultural life in this world. And all of a sudden I was like, that's what's missing. That's the thing that will unite everyone from a Comer to some normie Baptists to David French, across the board. You're going to find this resistance to that dynamic, to the idea of like corporate Christian agency in a masculine key applied to the social life in this world. And all of a sudden that was the connection to like, that's why people across the board, there's this resistance among evangelicals, certain segments, to what we call Christian nationalism. And in fact, I think that's underneath a significant part of that resistance, because that's the scary thing. And that's the one thing that you're not allowed. That's what you're not allowed to do. That's what's missing, is the minute that you say, hey, we're a group of men, we're going to get together and we're going to exercise social and political power for the good of others and the glory of God. You just expect you're going to get kneecapped. You're going to get like, you're not allowed to do that. And they're going to get checked. And that's true from a bunch of different directions. And the reasons given you for why you're not allowed to do that may be different depending on who you're talking to. Like the checks will be different, but the common thing is this is the one thing you're not allowed to do.
Yeah. Chase is someone who is, we might say, exercised his masculine agency recently, in recent memory. Socially, he's exercised it socially and publicly. What do you have to say about getting kneecapped? How intact are both of your knees at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an interesting experience to go out and try to do things, especially publicly, outside of maybe your normal pastoral duties. But you'll typically get checked by people who do kind of embrace a more pacifistic kind of approach to Christian engagement socially, which is really unfortunate. You get kind of a mixed response. You'll get some that are like quietly inspired. They'll text you. These are big Eva figures that'll be like, hey, I'm thankful that you're doing this. But, to their church, they're going to like just tell their church, well, we should just pray, and whatever the government says, we should just do it. You'll get some that are like, wow, thank God somebody's saying something. And we had lots of guys saying something. So there were plenty of us to go around. And you'll get others that absolutely abhor what we're doing. They've told us this, that we're an embarrassment. They can't believe we're getting engaged politically. And when you meet with them and you ask them, one of our friends, a Southern Baptist minister up here, met with one of these kind of mega church pastors and, asked him, like, are you teaching your church about the dangers of these kinds of sins, about sexual sin, transgenderism, homosexuality? And he was just so livid when he was pressed on these matters. Just even, this is a very mild-mannered pastor, that the gentleman stormed out of the restaurant they were meeting in and yelled at him on the way out. It indicts, so to speak. So I talk about it another way when I talk about faith. Faith inspires some people to join action in what God is doing and where God is moving, but it also indicts those who are pacifistic and look down on other Christians and spend their days really just capitulating to the culture and being scared and not engaging in masculine strength. And so there will be knives that come out that when you start to do that, that can look as varied as anything you say online, that can be very much a source of kneecapping or where you publish or anything like that. Or it can be something public. You go out and you try to do something to stop a really radical bill in Colorado, and these people just lose their minds. So you'll get blackballed from all sorts of, whether it's fellowships or, meetings or group chats or whatever it may be, if you choose to engage in this way. And that's just part of it. It's not like there shouldn't be any resentment and bitterness in that. It's just, that's reality. That's what's going to happen.
Well, Joe, something that struck me too that you said, I think, in one of the sections, is when you're talking about sports, you mentioned that youth sports in particular, is sort of a outlet for maybe one of the last remaining outlets for this type of masculine, let's just say masculine energy, masculine cooperation, masculine action that exists. And what struck me about that is that I think that's totally right. And you describe it correctly, that it's it's a last bastion. It's sort of hanging on, wherever you don't have trannies also participating, it's hanging on. And it used to be like, if you sort of read about, the 19th century American boarding schools and English ones, where you had this sort of muscular Christianity being incorporated into the ethos of these schools and their curriculum. It wasn't that sports was like, a sort of cut out, safe space to express the masculine energy. It was totally incorporated as something that is good for forming this, and everything about these schools. I mean, even like the bullying and stuff. Like I was reading about one, they used to like waterboard kids like the other kids would essentially. It was like, crazy stuff, but it was all about, we're producing leaders. All these are elites, and we're going to make them masculine, right? This is the whole thing. Like, the studying is kind of like a sideshow. It's to make you into men. And so sports was central to it rather than a safe haven. It was like, this is totally appropriate and a good outlet. On the one hand, get some energy out so you can control these guys a little bit more, but it actually, it's like Waterloo was over, was decided on the playing fields of Eton sort of thing. This is where you create real friendships, real bonds, and learn how to channel and exercise your masculinity, productively and with other men. So it's just such a weird shift in how we're thinking about this, and how, you talk a little bit about how the propaganda plays into this, but say more about that, and especially the friendship aspect, which you pull in C.S. Lewis from. But it just struck me that this is totally a foreign world to how 100 years ago we would have thought about this.
Yeah. So the youth sports thing is just like an option, like a bunch of little pennies dropped as I was kind of working on this. Is, Chase wrote his thing, and then all of a sudden it was like a couple of just dominoes fell together. One of which was, for years I've coached my sons in mainly baseball. Now I coach them in football as well. And I just remember when we were first starting out, I'm coaching with these guys who are either nominal Christians, nominal Christmas and Easter Catholics. They're not really, and we're in a very progressive city. We were in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what was interesting was just how into it they were. Like that, there was just like and there were really, like, it was exciting. It was fun. Like the planning. I think I was reading C.S. Lewis at the time on the Four Loves. I was probably writing Lewis on the Christian Life, and just noting like that there is this kind of masculine camaraderie where, Lewis talks about men, for as long as men have been men. Like if you're in the hunter gatherer phase, you're going on the hunt, and like men are going to spend a lot of time planning for the hunt. And then after the hunt, they're going to talk about what they did and who did what and what they can do better next time. And the kind of friendship, or he calls it companionship. It's not the highest form of friendship, but it's companionship. And I was just like, oh, that's what's happening right now. Like we're not hunting, the mastodon, but we are trying to get these 9-year-olds ready for a tournament. And then as I thought about that and how like much energy, how much time was being spent, it just occurred to me that for a lot of these guys, like this is the only place in their lives where this sort of thing can happen. And so it really mattered, because they're in jobs in normal corporate America that are, filled with Longhouse and HR, and it's an egalitarian space. And so they're constantly having to check that. And then all of a sudden, for like a couple of hours each week, they get to be out there, fathers and sons, coaches working as brothers in arms, to like work together without having to navigate that kind of space. It was a male space, and it was oriented toward ambition and courage. And can we get the boys ready? And I realized, like, yeah. And I thought, that's really great. That's an awesome thing. And then back then I connected the dots. I was planning a church at the time. And I was like, there's a similar thing happening here. Planting a conservative evangelical church, because it's one of the few places where, it's the pastors having the weekly meeting and we're kicking ideas around. Can we do this? Can we do that? How are we going to do it? Debriefing the service from last week. And again, it's like this camaraderie, pushing on each other, the jokes, the banter, the stress testing of our ideas. And I was like, again, this is one of the few places where this is allowed to happen, because most of society is it's mixed group, it's egalitarian, and you always having to check that masculine ambition. So it was that thing that then kind of made me think, that's an interesting element, but it's kind of like cordoned off and it's in a safe space. Like it's a pressure relief valve rather than an actual threat to anything about the governing regime. And I think this is again where all of a sudden, in the present conversations over, say, Christian nationalism, all of a sudden those same impulses have spilled the banks, and people are going like, well, could we do this and like reorganize society in such a way that it would be submissive to God? Like, could we honor God everywhere? Could we just do things? And that's where I think what Chase is describing as the animosity, so the guy that storms out of the mild-mannered pastor who all of a sudden storms out because he's angry, or Russell Moore being enraged watching Doug Wilson on CNN. Like, the common thread there is like, this is not supposed to happen. It's not supposed to be the case that groups of Christian men acting in submission to God for the good of their neighbors and his glory, to try to say, you know what, we're no to that. We're gonna reorganize society in a different way. You're not allowed to do that. And that's where I think the propaganda, that was the last little piece that was kind of one of the pennies. I had read at some point, this guy, I don't know, he's a pseudonym online, Kryptos, had written a series of articles on Jacques Ellul's book, The Propaganda. And I read it. I read a little bit of Ellul, but never read that book. And so I was reading it along. And one of the things he said, which was like a surprise to me, because when you think of propaganda, you think of people trying to manipulate your beliefs. Like, they're trying to change, they're trying to, like, you're watching the movie and then they're like flashing the propaganda messages in between, every frame or so that it kind of subliminally gets into your mind, and it's all about changing your beliefs. And the thing that Ellul says, and that he echoed, was propaganda is actually first about your actions. It shape your actions. And then whatever you want to think about your actions after you've done what they want, or after you've not done what they want, however you want to rationalize that or explain that, is kind of irrelevant. Like, they don't care how you believe or how you think first. They just want you to go along with the program. And I realized, like, that's the common thread. Like, it doesn't matter whether you resist corporate Christian male action in the civil sphere because you think, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, or because you think this is scary and I'm very concerned because of feminism, or because I'm premillennial. It doesn't matter what the particular reason that you're given. It's just the one thing that can't happen is corporate Christian male agency for the good of your neighbors. Like, that's the one thing that we can't do it. And so that was kind of like the things all kind of falling into place, and realizing like, oh yeah, so you can go coach your baseball team, but that's all it's going to be. And even I think there's ways in which you're allowed to have your evangelical, you can go plant your evangelical church, Chase, like go to Boulder and plant your evangelical church. But if you then decide, hey, because we're here, we're actually going to exercise our agency to influence the civil sphere and say, you can't trans the kids. It's like, no, you're not allowed to do that. It's okay to have your church in your evangelical ghetto, but it's not okay for you to say, hey, you know what? Everybody needs to worship Jesus and everybody needs to obey what he says. All the people. Like, that's the expectation, and that's the norm now for society. You'll get kneecapped. You'll get scary looks maybe from the liberals, from the progressives, but it's the other evangelicals who will be the ones to say, hey, get back in line.
Yeah. Yeah, the prison functionaries are the ones that are most important, which is just how I entirely consider David French and increasingly Russell Moore as prison functionaries at this point. David French is the archetype that he gets paid well to be the prison functionary. But in the way you were talking about this, I mean, one with the propaganda, that's actually how I often describe. I mean, the Christian magistrate is a little. He cares a little bit about the actual condition of your soul because he's a good Christian magistrate. But really, it's the propaganda. I don't care what you think. You just have to behave appropriately, right? So we're not actually peering into your soul, like everyone chill. And so actually, you live in your own Christian nationalist world now, or maybe it's a different kind. It's a religious nationalist world. That's what it's doing. We just care about your behavior. You're allowed to think whatever you want. Maybe you even can do the mass in private, or these sorts of things. But you must behave a certain way. This is just an inescapable dynamic of society. This is how it works. No one actually ever thinks they can get into your head, and they don't really care. But as you were talking about it's this sort of like management and maintenance versus, and management is always about performing a function, right, within a pre-existing system, whereas like real command or decision making, judgment, these are like masculine traits they want to perform. That's why HR is filled with women stereotypically, because it's management, it's maintenance, right? And so I think this is a lot of reason why Silicon Valley has been successful in drawing a lot of talent, because doing that, I mean, you guys were talking about church planting. That's that's a startup vibe, right? Like guys love that sort of thing. Huge risk, high likelihood of failure, but like the success would be awesome. And maybe just even more than that, love the process, right? Of getting to do that, love the experience of getting to do it. That's why I think like staying in academia or something where smart people may have been before, it's just totally a management environment, right? It's a very feminine environment. Whereas on the West Coast, guys skipping college and all this, this is one possible cause. That's like exciting for men. That's the closest you can get to crossing an ocean now, or conquering like an unknown territory, is doing something like that. And like men just want to do this. From both of you, what do you think in terms of how ministry, we'll talk, we're in a negative world. So this is what we're talking about. Things are changing. I mean, I wrote on this earlier this week about the way young men especially are behaving regarding religion, but how should ministry models, pastors and their general approach to their ministry adjust and think about incorporating these sort of dynamics into their posture and approach, not just to their congregation and the men there. So thinking about creating like outlets and the ability to express this masculine corporate action, real friendships, but then also the main thing we've been talking about underneath this, which is sort of the social, external, and political application of these things, having a public posture. Because you're right, Russell Moore is going to kneecap you if you do this, at least if you do it at scale and get noticed, like Doug gets noticed.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, a lot of the reform work has to start in the life of the man, whether a pastor or not. And so the way I try to encourage it is have kinetic experiences and try to get dynamic in your life with your body. This is why fitness is such a big deal right now for people. They're learning that just getting involved in fitness or doing something to exercise has some kind of, still I have theories, but undiagnosed effect on your psyche and how you experience other people and the Lord. And so I think the reform work, if they're trying to do stuff in their church, it's got to start with themselves. They have to actually have a masculine presence about themselves. There has to be kind of a healthy kind of risk-taking, dynamic, almost unpredictable, wily sense about them. Of course, this does not eliminate wisdom, prudence, maturity, holiness, all that kind of stuff, but there's got to be some masculine presence. Bring that into particularly the men in the church and encourage them to also grow in that kind of vitality. And that can be a lot of different ways. I mean, the frustrating thing is for churches, a lot of times they just limit themselves towards teaching. And so we're just going to teach it people and that will create it. And it can be more than that. It can be working together on building something on the church property or helping somebody on a home project as a kind of men's ministry initiative. But it needs to be kind of like we're going to do something together. I know one church planner in Iowa, he throws down jujitsu mats in his church. I don't know if it's the sanctuary or not, but they do that on a regular basis, and he's getting that kind of kinetic experience for his men, where they're engaging in that competition, that aggression, and learning how to tame it under God's lordship, not under the longhouse. And then outside of that, one of the frustrating things that I've seen is for a lot of typically a church will do like a men's retreat, and a lot of times they're really good. They'll go out in the wilderness and they'll have axes and arrows and horses and fire and meat. And this is very exciting for men. And so we love that. But then when time comes for the talks are still jettisoning in a lot of the spirituality that's very, encouraging them to be reflective and contemplative in ways that are inherently pacifistic. And so that's not to say we need to swing to the opposite and have like rah, just charge the hill type stuff all the time. But there needs to be some of that. And teaching through the Psalms would be a great way to do that. Let's do one Psalm on kind of the contemplative life, and one on the active life, and one on how to love people well and how to hate people according to God's word. So like all that could be in a men's retreat. So there's lots of opportunities for that. But I think for me, it always has to start with me before the Lord, me and my family, and then me with my elders, and then me into the church, the men, and then from there it has a snowball effect.
Real quick, if I can, I mean, something you just said at the end there, I've been thinking about for a while, and like have drafts written up on this. But it's every sort of historian worth his salt like recognizes, not just as a matter of chronology, but even causality. Like the Renaissance precedes the Reformation, right? Like there's stuff that happens in the Renaissance, including the Northern Renaissance, like in Germany, but this recovery of texts, all this kind of stuff, the new learning, these kinds of things are essential to what the Reformer gives them the tools, right, to be able to do stuff. The thing that's less talked about, a few have talked about it that I found, is like really not just getting the text, so just the teaching, as you're talking about, Chase, but like what we're supposed to do with these. And the Renaissance was this sort of, it was not just getting the ancients back, but it was getting sort of their mindset and virtues back as well, like, for better or worse. And it was sort of, if you categorize like the medieval period, probably somewhat unfairly, but as the contemplative life, it was the recovery of the active life. And so the whole point of recovering Plutarch and Xenophon and like the great stories is the Renaissance was always about social and political change through these ideas. Like they wanted to be active men, and that's what the heroes are, right? That's who they hold up. That's why all of a sudden merchants and mercenaries became people that maybe weren't disgusting, like they were actually cool. And the reformers inherit that approach to the text, and you see it in what they do, right, and what they hold up. And that's how in many ways their doctrine of vocation naturally flows from this sort of shift in their mind, right? And you can see it in their in the way that they're approaching text, not just that they're getting them. So I think really what we're seeing in a lot of young men is something like that. You've even seen this, Joe, you've contributed this to debates over the ressourcement movement. Like, what do we do with these things? I think that's the big divide. Right. Is this for the contemplative life, or is this for the active life? And people that have experienced certain things in the real world, in the active life, have definitely have a different disposition on like what I'm doing with this stuff. What do I need it for? What's it useful for? So I think that's blending those together, as you were talking about, Chase, is like if churches and pastors would do just that, even in just the way they teach them. So you can even keep it at teaching, but just like teaching that side of things, I think you would satisfy much of this. Guys would go out and figure out ways to do it together, even if you're not the pastor leading it. But so Joe, I wanted to kick it back over to you now.
Yeah. So I think that's right. And I think because of the nature of it is easy to kind of polarize or dichotomize the things to where and what people will hear is, oh, you're saying that you want to do all the social and political stuff and neglect the basics of kind of like personal spirituality and devotion. Like just don't pray, go vote, or don't pray, go act it, be an activist. And it's like, no, that's not the thing. Like worship still is the heartbeat. Corporate worship's the heartbeat. Your personal devotions, your personal engagement with God, like prayer, the reading of the scriptures, all of these things are fundamental and basic. The issue is don't put a tourniquet on it. So if you're going to do the worship stuff, like that was the image that kind of came to my mind. It's what I concluded the article with, was like worship will pump blood to all of the activities of the Christian life, like in every direction, and it will get into everything, unless you are like, no, we're gonna apply the tourniquet. It's not going to the right arm. Whatever happens, we're gonna cut off the right arm. Or if you use a different metaphor, it's like the river that flows out from worship is going to water everything unless you dam it up right there, and then it's not going to. And so I just want to tear down the dam, and I want to remove the tourniquet and say, let it go, let it get into everything. And so a number of years ago, this is my old church, we had a men's retreat, and we were doing kind of some of the fun stuff, basketball tournaments or whatever, kind of some active things. But in the teaching time, I basically laid out like, hey guys, so here's the deal about the household, and kind of walked through the kind of Chris Wiley type productive household stuff. That households used to be productive, now they're consumptive. They're the places where you consume. They're not, and they're divided, and all of the household functions have been outsourced to these other societal entities. And this is a problem. This is part of what's going on culturally, and we need to recover the productive household. So I kind of just like, I'm the pastor. I walk them through kind of that intellectual history, and then I get to the end and I say, and I'm just going to tell you guys, I'm not going to solve this problem for you. I can't. Like, it's not my job. My job is to tell you what the Bible says. So here's what the Bible says about the household and how it should function. And to try to explain, you put a little bit of my academic hat on. I'm a professor, and say, hey, here's some of the history about how we got where we are. But solving this is up to you. Like, you guys as men and it's a corporate, you guys have to get together. You guys are going to have to start some businesses. You're going to have to brainstorm your patterns of living in order to like make it work. I'm posing you a problem. You go figure it out. I'm not going to cookie cutter answer this for you. And so that's one way of like helping even men to see like, this is and no one else is coming. Like, no one else is going to fix this for you. Like, it's you. God put you here for this. The other thing, this is what we do at NSA, because I think over the years you do classical Christian education. So Logos School here and NSA both involved in classical Christian education. And you begin to notice a tendency, especially among the men, to be like, hey, we want to train the intellectual muscles. We love to study. We love to read. We want to read all these things. And you start to realize that it's like a certain muscle is atrophying. And so at Logos, this is why a number of years ago, they started a football program. They'd had some other sports. They were doing some, and that was all fine. But it was like, hey, football is really going to help the men develop. Like, you're going to have to go across the middle and maybe get killed by a linebacker. This is really good for you. Or, at NSA, we have a hall system where the guys play rugby. And it's like, we need you to play rugby. We need you to slam into each other, not shrink from contact. This is actually shaping you as a man. And then that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good man, right? You could take that strength and go use it in destructive and sinful ways. But we want to combine that with the robust worship, the biblical fidelity, all of the teaching that will then channel that masculine strength, that masculine excellence in productive and fruitful ways, so that you build and fight. And so it really is this kind of both and thing. And the purpose of, I think Chase was trying to draw it, hey, this needs to be masculine. It needs to be hard edged. It needs to not be soft and therapeutic without losing the experiential, but it needs to have this notion of duty and agency. And then I just want to come along and say, and it needs to be corporate, and it needs to be directed toward the glory of God and the good of your neighbors. Like, do things here. That's why you're here, right? That's why you're here.
It's such a weird problem for pastors, I would think. Just even like, I don't know, if you were John Owen and you're a chaplain, like in the New Model Army, right? Like, your main problem is not trying to get the guys fired up about battle or to be like violent. I mean, there are some crazy characters in that army. Your main problem is reminding them of holiness, of trying to channel and control that energy, teach them about glorifying God, so on and so forth. It's now a problem for pastors is like almost the other way, because as we were saying before, the John Mark Comer leftist, not right wing Chase model has no problem with the holiness and talking about even the contemplative life in its own way. I mean, I don't think Dallas Willard is like, where I go to for my intellectual stimulation, but it's like, there's no problem with that. Now it's almost like you need to create the animal to control it instead of just having to control the animal. It's like the animal's been so subdued and domesticated. But both of you mentioned Longhouse multiple times. I mean, that's like a, it's a euphemism for mere life, right? The Aristotelian idea that it's it's safe and it's just maintenance of your needs, and that's it. It's very, you stay inside. Whereas like in contrast is men wanting things that are not found there. They want glory, they have ambition, they want accomplishment. These are like intangible things that require them to risk stuff and violate the laws of safety, for the group and things.
Well, Doug, one of the ways Doug puts this is that I've heard him say, when it comes to like men, you want guys that you're having, like, it'd be much better to have guys where you're having to say whoa than guys that you're having to say giddy up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's the idea. And right now we do have a problem of like, how do I stoke some ambition in young men? Because they've been innervated by their white, like all of their education has been devoted to smothering their masculinity. The technologies are designed to just give them dopamine hits to kind of, numb them. And so you just doom scroll. And so there really is this like innervating, pacifying dimension, which again is very regime friendly. Like it was Chesterton, or maybe this may have been another Dougism, but like, he's like, the kind of freedom that the liberals are interested in is the kind of freedom that you can exercise in an 8x10 cell, right? Here's all the porn you could have. Here's the drugs. Here's the ways to like medicate your way. And you can do it all inside this cell. You can live in the pod and you can eat the bugs, and we'll keep you fat and happy. And it's like, that's not the freedom of a free man. Like, that's not the freedom that Christ offers us in this life or the next. It is an active and a direct, a mission oriented vision. And so to try to cultivate that in young men and in the men in your church, so that you are, and I think a lot of pastors, this is part of it too, is it's actually kind of nice to have the docile dudes. Like the docile dudes aren't going to give you fits. This is the point of that Lewis quote that I used in the article, was like, authorities always look a little bit hesitantly on, groups of men, because it's this little act of secession, potential rebellion if we don't watch it. And it's like, do you view your teenage boys and their energy as we gotta smother this? Or do you view it as we gotta channel this? Like, what are we gonna build with that? Where's that? How can we direct that strength? Which does require checking them. It does require direction, exhortation, and things like that. It's not free reign, do what you want. But I'd much rather be having a group of guys where you're having to say, hey, let's just ease off just a little bit. Rather than guys that you're like, come on, do something.
I know this is a huge problem. And I don't know if it's widespread. I think it is, where, when we're planting, Boulder, like Silicon Valley, very different, but similar, is like tech. And a lot of the guys that are Christian in tech have been kind of inculcated in this pacifistic attitude. And so when I would try to minister to them or just be friends with them, there's very little like preference they express. There's very little disagreement. And so you literally you have to try to goad them into conflict by offering an opinion that they're going to finally, voice an opinion on, to try to get them out of themselves. Many of these men are hollow men. And that's my frustration with Comer's spirituality, is it creates hollow men, these men without chest, these men who don't have agency. And even in how we read the scriptures, I've been thinking about this, and thought about writing on as well, is that, I think it's Joe and others have talked about reality respecters, and whether it's the Industrial Revolution or whatever, the modern world has basically so eliminated kind of a state of nature among people that they sense no need of hostility or men in general. And a lot of the Bible verses that we love and cherish, and we want people to believe and obey, like turn the other cheek or others, today sound like an endorsement of regime-friendly dispositions, when, like what you're talking about in the New Model Army, it's very much like, hey, don't forget this virtue that we're supposed to live into. And so that all of a sudden, if you're talking to that group of men, it all of a sudden becomes like, right, yes, okay, as we go, we must remember this is who we are, rather than teaching hollow men that just reinforces their pacifistic mindset. And so you're going to have to, I don't encourage physical interaction, but you can do that. You can, this is kind of a joke in corporate world, but you can go do like a ropes course team building exercise and put men in crisis and put these guys and see who rises, see who falls, see their dispositions. But for a lot of these hollow men in evangelicalism, they don't have dispositions. They're just kind of very stoic, and not in like a, the stoicism that's out there right now that's kind of returning.
Right.
They're stoic in the sense of like, there's nothing there. They have no, like, do you watch football?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a team? Do you have a preference? Do you have anything that's like makes you come alive? And so there must be some
Mm-hmm.
challenge and so that's going to be hard as a pastor because that we don't get taught that. Like, you're not taught to do that. You're taught to manage. And so there's got to be that provocation, and that can come through teaching. It can come through personal interaction. A lot of times in our ministry here, it's joking. So if a guy, and it's just a test, as men do, if a guy can't take a joke about himself or a joke about a thing he loves and take it in jest and turn it, that's an indicator of what I would sense is a lack of maturity and a lack of growth. And that's something to pay attention to. And so that's a simple way to kind of like begin to develop these things in the church.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure half of Chase's texts to me are like jokes trying to get my goat. Like, I feel like that's basically, he's just like, I'm not sure about you yet, Rigney. But it's interesting. Whenever I was in seminary, one of the first classes that we had, this was back at Bethlehem, was this new cohort of guys. They took us up and dropped us off in the Boundary Waters, in northern Minnesota or northern Wisconsin, I think. And they basically, we had two guides, and they kind of gave us some orienting stuff. Like, this is how you make a tent. This is how you read a topographical map. And they did it with us for like a couple of days. And then like on day 3, we were at this, we showed up this lake, and we instead of like keeping going, they're like, hey, we're going to stop here, camp here for a full day. And there was this kind of more contemplative, we're out in nature, we're about as far from anything as you can get. And it's like, hey, if you need some time, go pray, read, like kind of take it easy. And then we went to bed that night. We woke up and they'd like Navy sealed out of there, like at ODark 30, and just left the map and circled the spot and said, you guys need to be here by 5:00. And it was this great thing where all of a sudden we're like, oh, wow. Okay. So we're just a bunch of theology nerds, and we've been doing this for 2 days, and now we have to just figure it out. They gave us some canoes, and we're like, here's the canoes. You're going to have to portage some, but you need to somehow show up there before dinner. And it was like a really good, like, I think that, I've still got, close friends who went through that program, partly because like there was this bonding and this thing that happens because you are in a little more of the, oh, this is different. This is not just safe and protected, but certain virtues are going to have to come out. Who's good at what? Like, we started trying to figure out who can read that map the best, who can read the terrain the best. And then it was like, okay, you do that. And all of a sudden the division of labor, all of these things just start emerging right out of the gate because we were stress tested in that way.
So it was the state of nature.
It was the state of nature.
It was the state of nature. They didn't kill each other, so Hobbes is wrong.
That's right. It was not Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, that's good. The Bethlehem students didn't kill one another. That's good. That's a good result. Yeah, I think all this is, it needs to be talked about more. I mean, I think more and more people are recognizing it intuitively. I think it explains a lot of the trends that like befuddle people that are in some ways expressed online. Like, why are guys interested in social political thought now? I mean, this is why they want to know. They want to know like how they can do. The desire is there, but they want to know how they can do something. And some of that, I think, is because we live in a very safe place. There is no threat like you would if you're a medieval monarch of like insurrection, like groups of guys. Just don't threaten that to our government. It's a good thing. I don't want things to fall apart overnight, but it's when I think over the past 5 years in particular, maybe you could extend it the past decade, it's where in real life men coming of age have met conflict that is actual conflict, and it's driving and some of them don't know how to respond, so they just ignore it or try to pacify it and fear the reaction more than the actual thing. But much of this changed over the past 5 years with men coming into their 30s and 40s with families, recognizing there's like real, maybe even actual physical threats, right? So it's just created, and then realizing they don't have a group of guys. They don't actually have friends, to solve these problems with. And then they don't have a map with even a dot on it circled from anybody. They might not even have canoes, they have like no materials. So I think it's been this energy of, we got to get stuff. We have to kind of prepare. And I think that explains a lot of it. And that's all very, very natural. And it's a welcome sign. But
Timon, I'd like to add one thing.
Go ahead.
Kind of on that idea of returning, so to speak. this plays out in my mind if I'm trying to paint a picture of the different experience in this way. In college, and I think this is coming from many evangelical men, it was very common to like learn guitar and learn worship music and then sing worship music with friends, Christian friends. And typically those songs were very like Shane and Shane, very pop Eva songs. And they would get around, and it's very like mellow, not highly produced. We're singing to the Lord. There's something sincere and authentic there. The other flip side of that is you get in a lot of churches today where they're using hymnals only. They're singing a cappella, and it's a very similar type, like state of nature type worship experience where we're not being led by, musicians that are professionals and sometimes paid. There's not a huge sound system. There's not lighting everywhere. It's like a very basic worship. And what if we could have that? What if we could have just a very normal worship? So even singing together as men is something that should inspire and uplift and let us delight in the Lord and then move towards action. I think that itself is a great little paradigm of something I'm trying to hit at, because it's not wrong. The instincts of the young Christian in college or high school to sing worship songs, very good. Like I want them to, but how do we mature that into something that then produces, action in the public square and inspires them to more than just contemplation?
Joe, any parting thoughts as well? We're starting to come up on time here, and you guys have been
I think that's right. I think that recognizing that this is, I think basically this is another observation from C.S. Lewis, that nature abhors a vacuum, and these different aspects, appetites of our nature, masculine nature, if it doesn't gobble food, it will gobble poison. And so it's not a question, like it's like this ambition, masculine ambition, the desire to build something, the desire to act in concert, can either be channeled in productive ways or destructive ways. Like it's a not whether but which. And so I think that it is an issue for pastors and for Christian communities to really reckon with, like, how are we encouraging fruitful and productive Christian agencies corporately? Like, what are we building together as a way of making sure? Because otherwise, eventually you'll get the revenge of corporate, masculine agency, and that revenge will be ugly, and we won't like it, and it will then, and all of a sudden we'll be behind the eight ball because we're not ready for this. And so in the meantime, I think let's go ahead and get to work. And don't. I think the other kind of piece of counsel. This is one of the things I've really appreciated since moving to Moscow that I don't think I appreciated from a distance. Whenever you watch really, the videos and there's a high level of technical capacity and things like that, but that's of recent vintage. The key thing has always been do what you can with what you have. Like don't feel like I've got to have it all figured out or I have to have all the best tools. It's like, well, what has God given you right now? Be faithful with what he's given you, not what he hasn't given you. Right? Be faithful in a little, and then trust that if you're faithful with it, like this is the promise from God, he'll give you more. He'll say, all right, I'm going to give you more. I'm going to give you more because you've been faithful with the little. And so I think don't wait until you think you have it all together to get started. Get started with what you have.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for getting your thoughts out there, writing on this and talking about it. I know you'll continue to do so. And hopefully others join in, contribute to this discussion that we're having both on our pages here at the podcast. So thank you, listener, for tuning in, and do subscribe and all that. And until next time, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at AM Reformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at americanreformer.org. That's americanreformer.org.